Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us into the afternoon. It's a very good turnout for this kind of slot. The other room must be empty. I'm Chris Goulden from Joyce Rowntree Foundation, and we're very proud to be one of the sponsors of the event today. For those of you that don't know, JRF is a charity that funds mainly social research into the causes of and solutions to poverty. And one of the big causes of poverty in the UK is problems with our labour market. So we're very interested in what solutions to poverty we can find through labour market interventions. So we're going to explore some of that today, looking at the interaction of supply and demand in our labour market and what we think can help us deliver solutions to poverty as well as improving job quality. JRF has funded quite a large research programme recently. The report's coming out soon with the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, looking at the future of the labour market. And we'll be hearing a bit about some of that today. So the other speakers are Robert Joyce from Institute for Fiscal Studies, who's been a member of the team doing some of that research, and he'll tell you some of the quite surprising, but I'm afraid depressing conclusions from that research. And then we'll hear from Tim Foster from DWP to talk about some of their own labour market work and about the universal credit. Moira McKerracher from UK Commission for Employment and Skills will speak about their position. And then finally we have Vinny, Pattison from Ingeus, who will talk about some of their work, and then there'll be time for questions. So about half the session is presentations and half will be open for discussion and questions. So I think we should proceed. So initially, Robert will tell you about some of his work.
Thanks, Chris. So yes, this is obviously a very broad topic in principle, so I'm not going to attempt to cover everything. Looking at the brief I was given of what this session is supposed to cover, I'm going to focus on the first bullet on that brief, which is what do changing labour and skills demand mean for poverty and living standards of UK workers? And as Chris said, something very relevant here is some work we've recently done, funded by JRF and UK CES, looking at how forecast changes and other hypothetical changes in the labour market over the next decade might affect the income distribution. And I really want to focus on one quite specific point within that, because I only have a few minutes, which is to do with the way that we typically think about the way that we typically measure outcomes in the labour market, and how that's often not very well suited to giving you an indicator of how labour market changes are likely to affect household income. And this is very relevant. Living standards are often measured using incomes, and specifically household incomes, and for very good reason, which is that we think there's probably a lot of income sharing going on within households. If you're measuring incomes at the household level because you think that's the way you should think about living standards, I would argue that there's often a problem with the way that we present labour market statistics and think about labour market outcomes. They tend to be based very much upon individuals. And I'll try and flesh out my point with just a few examples from things that have come out of the work that we've recently done. So this is a point that's been made before. One particular example is work that IFS have done on the minimum wage before, which has shown that minimum wage workers are not particularly densely concentrated at the bottom of the income distribution. There are many reasons why you might advocate a minimum wage, but one of them it should not be that it's a well-targeted poverty reduction strategy. The reason is just that low-paid individuals tend to be distributed right across the household income spectrum. Many of them are second earners, for example, in two-earner couples, and of course also many of the people right at the bottom of the income distribution aren't in work at all. And so we've shown previously that the changes in the minimum wage aren't particularly good instruments for changing poverty rates, for example. And actually, if you care about relative poverty specifically, which many people do, then you have an additional problem, which is you can actually make things worse by raising median income and therefore the relative poverty line and raising poverty if you do this kind of thing. And actually, it is the case that there are more minimum wage workers around the middle of the income distribution than at the bottom. And one of the things that's come out of this recent work we've done for JRF and UK CES is really we've shown that this basic point holds for a much more general class of labour market changes, which are often assumed, I think, implicitly or explicitly to be helpful in reducing poverty or achieving distributional goals more generally. So things like narrowing the wage gap between occupations or gender, or increasing the returns to low levels of skills in the labour market. These are things, again, the individuals which are affected by these tend to be attributed right across the household income spectrum. And so they're generally poorly targeted ways of achieving specific distributional objectives if you're thinking about household incomes. And policymakers normally are. Incomes are measured at the household level in official government statistics. The government has specific targets relating to household-based income measures. Its child poverty target, which is obviously very, very high profile. So this really matters for poverty, and it matters when policymakers or others, as I say, implicitly or explicitly assume that particular kinds of labour market changes are going to be helpful in achieving these very specific goals in relation to household incomes. And I think so for example, when you see people talk about the distribution of earnings, they're almost always talking about the distribution of individual pre-tax earnings across workers. Whereas I think it would often, it's certainly in the context of thinking about living standards, which is presumably what we ultimately care about, it would often be better to be thinking about household level measures of earnings if you can, measures of employment. And if you do that, there are lots of interesting things to get your teeth into, and people have it's not like I'm the first person to say this, people have documented trends in employment outcomes at the household level, and they're very important. So we know, for example, from work by Paul Gregg and others, that there's been an increasing polarisation of employment across households, an increasing number of two-earner households, but also an increasing number of zero-earner households. And this is, they've actually devised a nice index with which you can measure this polarisation and shown how it's fluctuated over time. And that seems to me a very relevant thing to be looking at when you're actually thinking about the distribution of household income. And similarly, we know from other work that the correlation between the earnings of people within a household has been increasing. And again, this tends to increase household income inequality, because it means you get concentrations of high-income individuals in the same household. It seems to me these really are the relevant things to be thinking about if you want to achieve specific distributional objectives, rather than focusing on the pay of low-paid individuals in isolation. And clearly there are ways in principle of doing this, of focusing on household-level employment outcomes, and ways for policymakers to do this. You can tweak incentives for first earners as opposed to second earners through the tax and benefit system. You could focus conditionality such that it's focused on low-income households rather than individuals. They're all I'm not advocating any of these specifically, but I'm just pointing out clearly there are in principle ways of shifting the focus to the household level, and I think that this really should be done rather more. And in general, I think policymakers and others should really just be clearer about what the links actually are between what they want to happen in the labour market and their distributional objectives. And the link is often not made explicit, and actually when you look at what the link is, it often is not there. The link between, for example, minimum wage policy and poverty really is not the one that is often implicitly assumed at all. I'll probably already used my 5 minutes. I think I'll stop there.
Do you want to say anything about any of the headline figures?
So the project that we've done looked at, took a bunch of very detailed labour market forecasts over the next decade that people at the Institute for Employment Research at Warwick have produced, which are going to be talked about in a session later in more detail, and put these into our model of the household income distribution to see what these changes in employment that are forecast imply about change in the distribution of income. And they are very much inequality increasing. So one factor there, for example, is it continued hollowing out of the labour market by occupation, so continued concentration of people in sort of high occupation and low-paying occupation jobs. So in many ways, we're forecasting a continuation of what we know has happened in the labour market over the last couple of decades. Changes acting to increase inequality. And then it's the second thing is we looked at various hypothetical other changes to relative pay or relative employment rates amongst different groups, which might help to counteract some of these underlying trends. And that kind of brings me back to what I focused on, which is that it's actually very difficult to find trends which focus on particular kinds of individuals, which are very effective at reducing income inequalities when you're measuring income at the household level. Is that a good synopsis? Yep.
Thanks, Robert. We'll hear from Tim now. If what Robert said has sparked anything that you'd like to comment on, please do so.
Hello, can you all hear me? Lovely. Hi, so as Chris said, I'm Tim Foster. I'm from DWP. My role in DWP is that I'm the senior labour market analyst. So my teams are responsible for not only for that kind of overview of the labour market and what's going on, as far as we can tell, and but also the teams that work with people on the, like those on the panel to evaluate active labour market policy and help design things like the work programme, the youth contract, and Job Centre Plus based policies. I'm going to focus in this short bit mainly on kind of activation and active labour market policy. And as this room probably knows all too well, I mean, DWP traditionally has focused and has a very strong background in active labour market policy, which focuses on getting people off benefit and back into work as quickly as possible. And we've developed quite a lot of expertise over the last kind of 10 to 15 years on the kind of what might quite often are described as, relatively light touch pre-employment support that offer kind of personalised, tailored advice, normally through Job Centre Plus advisors or through providers like Ingeus, and really focus on kind of boosting the individual's chances of getting back to work as quickly as possible. We haven't traditionally focused on supply side policy, partly because that's the role of biz and the growth strategy, but partly because we are very much about kind of boosting the active supply of labour. And as I said, our core labour market objective has been to maintain, if not speed up, the rate at which people get back to work as quickly as possible, because we've always known that is the primary way in which we are able to maintain and increase the employment rate, and through that deliver on a broader set of social objectives for the government. So that's kind of why we've always done what we've done. And we've built up over the years quite a strong evidence base about our effectiveness, not always cost effectiveness, but usually our effectiveness at improving the chances of getting people back to work, and in particular preventing long-term kind of wage scarring for individuals. It's a bit of a caricature, but we've generally been fairly sceptical about programmes which generate what we describe as kind of lock-in effects, which take people away from active job search and put them, say, into kind of training or volunteering, but actually when people are away from the labour market, that we can see that their labour market outcomes get worse, that we need to keep people active and engaged in job search in particular. And importantly for this discussion, we've not really focused on, it's fair to say, on kind of keeping people in work once they're there. So we focus very much on getting them from off benefits and into work in quite a simple way. And we've struggled in some cases to design effective policies and to put the right incentives into job centres to really promote kind of sustainability in work and find effective ways of managing kind of retention in work. You probably know that in the work programme, for the first time really, we're paying very much for sustained outcomes over a much longer period of time than we have done in the past. And so that's quite a big step forward for us. I wasn't here this morning, but I heard Tony Wilson talk a little bit about ERA, the Employment Retention Advancement pilot, which DWP has been running for quite a long period of time. So I was going to tell you a little bit about ERA, but it may be that I don't need to, but if Tony didn't cover this morning, I mean, basically it was a pretty major randomised trial that DWP ran for lone parents, long-term unemployed, and importantly for people on working tax credit. We ran it as a very pure randomised trial. It ran for a very long period of time. We picked up all sorts of, we tracked people basically over a long period of time to see what the impact was on employment and earnings. It demonstrated some really interesting results. But we couldn't find any kind of persistent results, and we certainly couldn't find any cost-effective results that really kind of demonstrated to us that we could do. I mean, particularly in work support and clear financial incentives in a cost-effective way. So we're still very much at the drawing board. Universal credit for us kind of represents a huge opportunity to rethink our labour market objectives. clearly it's all still at quite an early design stage, but exactly those kind of questions that Robert started to talk about are quite upfront in our minds, really. So what does universal credit mean for our labour market objectives? Clearly we need to move away from this very kind of binary, either you're either you're in benefit, on benefit, or you're in employment, to something which is probably more about progression, about how we can actively help and encourage people to move up the earnings scale in a much looser way than we've done before. If people have been following the policy debate around universal credit, I think you'll know there won't be anything, and there can't be anything like in universal credit, like the 16-hour rule, which forces people to choose between work, training and benefit. And the opportunities are there now to do something which is much more flexible. We need to think about the right balance of support between people who are not working at all and what we do for people who are in some form of work, and just how much work do you need to be doing before the government, the state, feels confident enough to step back. And that's both in terms of the kind of support and advice that we might offer to people. And it's also about the conditionality that we might apply to universal credit. And it's fair to say that that's all at a very early stage, and I can talk about some more of that in discussion, but we are thinking very much about these issues, as well about the household question too. Chris, would you like me to stop at this point?
No, carry on. Particularly if you're talking about poverty, then carry on.
And I'm not an expert on distributional questions, I'm afraid, but it does seem to me that actually there is a real opportunity here to bring together and make more explicit our labour market objectives and what it is we're trying to achieve in the labour market, the way in which universal credit will work with our labour market interventions, and in a bit clearer way than we've been able to before, I think, bring together our kind of poverty and social justice and our kind of welfare to work ambitions. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we'll hear from Moira, if you wouldn't mind. If you could say a bit about what the Commission's kind of current perspective is on all this, that'd be helpful.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'll stay in my seat as the furthest away from the podium. Yeah, I mean, it was quite a broad topic area we had for this workshop. So I thought, coming from the Commission, which is, in case you're not aware, a social partnership really. We're governed by a board of commissioners who come from mainly employers, large and small, but also trade unions and third sector representatives, as well as experts from higher education, further education, and so on. So our perspective tends to be the employer perspective, and how we might go about, in this case, focus on how we might incentivise employers to create good jobs which will benefit their businesses, the economy and individuals, but also to create space for people who need to get into employment. Because there are a couple of emerging trends in the labour market that are making it particularly tough. It's polarising, middle-level jobs are in decline, so the traditional step up from the low-level jobs to the high-level jobs, that middle step, is getting kicked away to some extent, makes it harder to progress. So losing more jobs in the middle means some of the more highly skilled workers are bumping down and displacing lower skilled workers. Bumping down, of course, increases competition for the elementary jobs. And unemployed people are also competing with those who are in work, looking for more hours in their current job, and there are a lot of those at the moment, 1/10 of the current workforce looking for more hours in their current role. And of course we know that things are particularly hard for young people. Structural changes in the labour market particularly having an impact on them. Young people are predominantly employed in sales and elementary occupations, hardest hit by the recession, forecast to be little or no growth in these occupations, looking forward to 2020. The importance of small businesses rising, in itself, of course, no bad thing, but smaller firms are more likely to use informal recruitment practices and to emphasise experience when they're recruiting people, and both of these tough for young people. Replacement demand will account for 90% of the job openings up to 2020, which predominantly rise from retirement, of course. And young people are poor substitutes in many ways for retirees. You're not replacing like with like there. And the fact that experience is vital to so many employers is tricky and getting trickier for young people, because whereas it used to be fairly normal for young people to be in full-time learning, also to be doing some sort of job part-time and on a Saturday, the share of 16 to 17-year-olds in full-time learning who also work has fallen from 40% in the 90s to 20% currently. So that way of getting experience is in decline too. So that's happening in the labour market. You would expect me to say something about skills coming from the Commission. We know that skills are really important to people's employment prospects, and low skill levels have a bigger impact on people's employment prospects than almost anything else. So the employment gap between the low qualified and the average working age population is continuing to widen and is actually declining over time, whereas the gaps have been closing for other disadvantaged groups, so people from ethnic minorities, those with disabilities, lone parents, older workers. So the low skill factor is a crucial factor in determining your employment prospects. So important to individuals, and of course workforce development is an intrinsic part of securing economic growth. So how do we encourage more of this workforce development to happen, and in ways that actually address economic, business and individual needs? We've tried lots of different ways, lots of public money being invested in this. But I think the Commission, speaking from the point of view of the Commission, our latest ideas, and it's one angle and one perspective, there's no single solution to all of this, is our ideas centre on employers taking more ownership of the workforce skills agenda and in encouraging closer integration of the employment and skills agenda. There's a bit of a tendency at the moment to see training as a bolt onto a job rather than looking at the job within which training and progression are integral. And we've developed a kind of habit of incentivising businesses to join government schemes, and so participation tends to last only as long as the funds last. And in these schemes, government have tended to prescribe the training solutions and set out what's eligible. So we think that we need now to think about creating the conditions for employers to own the agenda, to develop the skills they need to compete and make it easier for them to do this. And we've begun to encourage this. This is going to have to be a groundswell and built up gradually. It's a culture change for both the way we think about the policy and the way employers think. But we've started, and we have management responsibility for a couple of investment funds. So a new way of using public money, not grant funding it out, but asking employers to invest alongside us. So bid into funds like the Employer Incentive Funds, the Growth and Innovation Funds. So these are funds which incentivise employer-driven solutions to skills and recruitment challenges, both in sectors and in localities. So, you know, we're starting to see a couple of examples. We've had about 6 months or so of these funds up and running. They're very new, but starting to see some interesting initiatives come through. And we've also launched, working with BIS and the SFA, we launched our vision of employer ownership, and working with BIS and SFA, we've just launched employer ownership pilot funds, routing more of the public contribution for training directly through employers for things like apprenticeships, pre-employment training and work experience. Again, the idea that this is a continuum. This isn't just about bolt-on training, thinking about the job and progression in the round. So we want to continue with this kind of thing, nurturing employers' ambition and their capacity for skills, encouraging them to work with partners like unions, other representative bodies and providers. We want to grow employer networks because we think both at sector, supply chain and local level, because we think that that's the way we'll get the small businesses engaged as well. And we want to help broaden the government's rationale for investment to embrace entry into employment, on-the-job training, off-the-job training, and progression. So its ultimate aim is that skills are aligned to growth and situated within the end-to-end employment experience. I'll leave it there.
Sounds very interesting. Vinny.
Can everyone hear me at the back? Yep. With my Lancashire accent, can everyone understand me at the back? Good stuff. My name is Vinny Pattison. I'm a Senior Policy and Research Manager at Ingeus. We're a prime provider on the work programme. Our CEO spoke this morning at length about who we are, what we do. The focus on my comments today in the 8 to 10 minutes hopefully that I've got will be about how can we give unemployed people on the work programme the skills to succeed in terms of sustaining and progressing in employment. I think it's important that we focus on this from probably 4 main reasons. One would be to kind of upskill the long tail of low-skilled in the economy because it has kind of UK PLC value in terms of increasing productivity. I think the financial dynamics of the work programme means that there's an increased industry focus around the role of skills in enabling and facilitating sustainable employment with progression, and there's a broader kind of value for money from the taxpayer arguments there. I think there's also, from the perspective of some of the design features of universal credit, which we've been hearing about today, particularly the move towards in-work conditionality for some client groups. I think it's very important to be thinking about these issues now. I think it's also important from the unemployed person themselves being able to have the skills to be able to manage the transitions, firstly into the labour market, which for many is quite a challenge in and of itself, but also to be able to manage the transitions through the labour market, so that when this jobs-rich future we've been talking about, that everybody can play a role in it. It also has a role around enabling social mobility as well by moving into work and progressing. So what does this mean for the work programme? I suppose what it means is that the work programme increasingly has to be an authentic interface for the skills system. I think one which kind of equips unemployed people with the vocationally grounded skills to be able to enter employment, sustain, and to be able to progress. Now, I think whilst there's clear evidence around basically the employment prospects of those with no or minimum few skills, I think there's less clear as to what exactly works when it comes to between skills and dynamics around sustainability and progression. So what I briefly want to do in the next 5 minutes or so is quickly focus on 5 lessons that we could take from the work programme in terms of how we can give unemployed people the skills to be able to enter work, sustain and progress, which I kind of appreciate is quite a big challenge to do, but yeah. Just a few broad reflections from a work programme provider perspective. I think basic, functional and employability skills are the foundations upon which labour market entry, sustainability and labour market progression are based. And I think it's key that we must get these basics right. I mean, we see as an industry that a lot of people coming onto the programme don't have some of the basic skills, don't have some of the employability skills. And it's about getting those basics right first. Literacy, numeracy, IT skills, combined with some of those softer skills around motivation, around communication skills. I mean, we've done some work with employers, just some research, that suggests that over 85% of the employers that we work with would rather have somebody with a good attitude than good qualifications at the point of recruitment. So I think these kind of basic functional and employability skills are absolutely key for any movement within the labour market. I suppose mainly because whilst competencies will differ according to which industry you go into, the specifics will differ. What will hold, what will remain, will be needing to have these basic skills. The second point I'd like to make is that I think that the seeds of an individual's sustainability and progression are actually sown on the work programme. I think through having an effective diagnostic process to be able to identify what the skills needs are of an individual and how these interact with the other barriers to work that they have, I think it's very important to understand this in terms of then moving forward with a personalised approach to be able to address the skills needs. Often this is about, as much about developing self-confidence, self-efficacy, motivation, as it is about instilling what we think of the harder skills. I think self-efficacy is absolutely key. Sometimes it's not just that, you know, a client may say that they can't do something. Now, actually they can, but it's just not having that self-belief to be able to go forward and actually engage in the learning. I think that's a key element of what we can do on programme. So to me, sustainability and progression are not concepts of which we should think about at the point at which somebody moves into work. It should be ground from day one, and actually these things used as carrots, if you will, throughout a customer journey in terms of progression. That said, I think it's also important that we focus on the role of skills and the sustainment and progression when somebody moves into work. I mean, what's going to be key for us in terms of achieving the sustainability that we need to do on the work programme is that in-work support, that advisor contact, to be able to kind of, not a hand-holding role, but it's about, again, instilling the confidence, giving the individual the tools to be able to sustain and progress. I think we can be upfront, and it's no secret that clients, some clients that move into employment through the work programme won't be moving into their ideal job in the first instance. They'll be moving into a job. And one of our roles as part of this kind of sustainability and tied up within that and progression would be this kind of ABC approach, which I've heard from some of the US literature, about helping somebody into a job, then into a better job, then into a career. And I think this, again, is about as much about developing self-efficacy, self-confidence, as it is about giving them the skills once in work. Because we will be seeing clients for up to 2 years once they move into work, so that in-work support is absolutely key on the skills side. I think fourth, it's been mentioned this morning, but I think too often it doesn't get mentioned in these sorts of debates, is the centrality of employers to the employment and skills system. I mean, the demand side, the needs of the demand side have to be at the very heart, the very centre of any supply side interventions. Or else, you know, what are we doing? It's an employment programme. We need to understand the demands of employers in different local labour markets in different industries. Now, we can do this from ensuring that skills provision has some resonance with the needs of employers, that actually skills provision is potentially held more to account for the employment outcomes in which it achieves. I think it's also important, I mean, we engage, as do other providers, with thousands of small, medium and large employers across the UK to really understand what it is that they're looking for, to be able to use that information to inform our provision, to be able to inform clients about what it is employers are looking for, what are their expectations. It's almost that real-time careers advice within the local economy. It's that sort of thing which is absolutely key and needs to be fundamental to a skills system. I also think employers have a second integral role to play, in that it's employers who dictate the structure of a job and the structure of the workplace. And this is essential to the creation, or in many cases not, of having those progression routes within that employer or through that industry. Now, we've heard arguments today about this kind of the labour market polarisation. There's also arguments around a low-skill equilibrium, about some of the structural issues within a UK labour market that limit the progression routes for low-skilled people because there's just not the demand there. The demand doesn't exist for higher skills. Now, I think these are structural issues that we really need to be getting to grips with. It's about skills utilisation. But I don't think these issues are intractable, and I actually think work programme providers, other labour market intermediaries, have a key role to play when it comes to the skills utilisation agenda, in that we understand the supply side. We have many, many thousands of clients. We also interact with employers. I think as being that nexus of supply and demand, I think we can be working with employers and are starting to do, but have much more that we could be doing around the skills utilisation agenda. I think this is important for progression. And while some people say, well, actually, you're not rewarded for progression on the work programme, that's true. But for quite a lot of our clients, without having that sense of progression, they will not sustain. And I think also it's incumbent on us at the moment to be collecting the evidence base for the next iteration of the work programme, whatever that's going to look like, which may well have a progression element to it, I think also because of universal credit and the need of our in-work conditionality, and that some of our clients will have to have some form of progression potentially to remain eligible for universal credit, it's important that we engage these debates now and that we're collecting the evidence about what works. I'm aware of the ERA trials, and I think we can try to build on some of that. Finally, I appreciate I've probably gone well over. I tried to have some notes here which kept me to time, but obviously it didn't work. I think there's a lot already going well on the work programme. I mean, I can see it from my perspective. I know there's work programme providers in the room. I think, we're doing quite well in terms of the embedding skills within our clients to enable them to move into work, to be able to sustain in work, and to hopefully to progress in work. But I think there can be more that could be done. I think there's more progress that we need to make on this agenda. I think for the work programme to be this authentic interface to the skills system, which I've talked about, I think the government needs to continue with the reforms to enable a greater orchestration of funding across employment and skills, to be able to join it together at the individual, to have an effective training and skills offer for some of the most disadvantaged people in our society. Now, I think we're already seeing this with some of the moves by Biz, and some of the policy rhetoric is great about integrating skills with employment. And I think this should continue. I think trying to embed employment outcomes within some of this skills funding would be a positive step forward and would enable work programme providers to play more in the employment and training space, which I think is beneficial given our employer connections in particular. However, I just don't see these things as being optimally aligned at present to provide this seamless provision, which ideally we would like to see. We are currently trying to orchestrate funding, as I say, from the job brokerage provision of the work programme, because that essentially is what the work programme is, with the kind of the basic functional and industry skills provision that can be funded through the SFA. I think for a better alignment of this, the work programme could be the vehicle around which an explicit focus on employment outcomes should permeate the skills system. This would allow us to be a lot more responsive, I think, to employer needs in terms of dynamically responding to some of the training courses that they would want so that we can put more people into employment, which has that real demand-side focus on the training. It's not about trying to have some of these opportunity costs of somebody being parked on a training programme. It should be something that is fundamentally labour market led, which every little bit of a thing that is learnt is through the prism of labour market job search and labour market demand. I think we can be more responsive, as I say. I think this would be potentially a discussion point for question and answers about how exactly we do that. But I think it's absolutely integral in terms of enabling better labour market attachment, enabling better functioning labour markets, and enabling the clients that we see, some of the most disadvantaged people in our society, to actually be able to take advantage of the kind of this, in terms of the jobs growth that's going to come, that they are actually a part of it. That is something that, it's the kind of the rising tide lifting all boats kind of argument. I think it's absolutely essential so that they can play a part in labour market future, and also the role that has in terms of social mobility. I'm going to keep it there. I think there's a lot more to say, but we can try and pick it up in question and answers.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll go up here so I can see all the questions at the back. This session is quite tricky because it is kind of about everything. And I think governments and other institutions have trouble with that too. So you have a jobs growth agenda that's separate from a work programme agenda, that's separate from a child poverty agenda, that's separate from a social mobility agenda, and so on. But I'm very happy if people have questions or even better answers that look at that big picture, or if you want to take it in smaller chunks. I'm particularly interested in hearing from any employers in the room. I know there was at least one this morning because he was doing some tweeting about what this means for employers. There's a question on the paper about what mix of incentives is right to raise employer ambition. So I'd be interested in what you think about that, whether that's the right question, and if so, what some of the answers might be. So are there any points or questions for the panel? Yes, Yes, over here, please.
I can just follow on, sorry, don't have anything you said. Can I just follow on from the point you just made about incentives for employers to engage? SMEs, particularly micro businesses, many of them, if they've only got less than 5 employees, are not in a position often to take on new employees, apprentices, trainees, and particularly those who may come with more issues than mainstream economic people. So I think in terms of incentives, it's not only incentives, there's a lot to do with infrastructure that can be provided for micro businesses, HR help, and just facilitation of getting those young people into that employment. If they come from a background of worklessness, there's going to be no structure or frame of reference that they have for employment. And so they're going to need extra help to get into employment and to sustain that employment. So, and I think that is something that I'm not hearing anywhere, and it needs to be addressed, because a lot of people go for large businesses because there's only a smaller number of them, so they're easier to contact. But the tiny micro businesses, they need more people to grow and to help them to be more successful, but they can't often facilitate employing people simply because they don't have the resources. So we need to think about how we can give them access to those resources to help them employ more people.
Okay.
Wasn't a question, sorry.
No, well, I can think of questions that come off it in terms of maybe for the Commission, how you engage with smaller enterprises as well as kind of self-employment, and maybe Vinny, the same in terms of the work programme.
Absolutely.
And then for DWP and IFS, how important are smaller companies in terms of those wider objectives within universal credit and on poverty?
Maybe I could say 2 things then. One is that we do a massive survey of employers of all sizes, 80,000 every 2 years. There was a huge unawareness particularly among small employers, of the government offer of support. So I think there is an issue there about some very small businesses would welcome taking on an apprentice with all the incentives and the financial help that's available there, or a work experience placement, or if they knew the support that was available to them. So there's an awareness issue that we need to crack with the smaller employers. And the second point was one of the issues for that very reason, how do you engage the small employers where some of the jobs are going to come? And they're starting to emerge some interesting models of, and again, this is why we want to try and boost through our funds employer networks. So the larger employers pooling their supply chains through, or a sector bid which pools different sizes of companies through, or a local bid where somebody is putting together, especially for small employers in the locality. And even with things like work experience, we see a good example from the media industry, for example, where there are loads of tiny employers, often self-employed, where Channel 4 has a federated model of work experience that it offers. So it coordinates everything, takes all the pain away, and knows that a small business, well, I couldn't take somebody for 2 weeks or for a full, but I could give them a day a week or half a day with me, or I could give them some mentoring, and Channel 4 organises all of that. So I think when you start to ask employers what solutions in a network they come up with really good ideas, and we want to encourage more of that.
Thank you. Vinny?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose from a work programme perspective, some of the things that you talked about in terms of the services that a micro business or a small business would benefit from is part of our service offer. So we have a team of around about 80 people that is our employee services team, and the functions that they perform would be partly about taking away the HR function, the hassle of employing an individual. So we can provide that sort of support, but I think there's a kind of a bigger issue at play about how we have a bit of a reactive and a proactive means of working with employers. And I suppose in the first instance, as the work programme's just starting up, and just from a kind of a purely stakeholder management perspective, it is easier to engage with the Tesco's, with the Morrisons that have 1,000 vacancies and you've just got the one point of contact, than 1,000 small employers, each with one vacancy each. So I think in the first instance, yes, it is more difficult to engage with them. But I suppose there is that reactive and proactive. There is the ensuring through the FSB, for example, that small employers, micro businesses know about the work programme so that they can approach us and we can speak to them about the services that we offer. But I think also there's an onus on us to be working locally and be more proactive in terms of getting out into the local business community, and we are working with the CBI, the BCC, to actually be able to identify some of the smaller businesses which would also benefit from the services. I mean, something I've spoken to Moira about very, very briefly in the past has been about the role of a GTA, a group training association type of model within localities, whereby, you know, I suppose employers could come together to access some of the functions around the work programme, so that they could benefit from it, but it would also ease some of the stakeholder management issues as well. Whether that would work, it's not actually an Ingeus policy, it's just something that was bouncing around in my head, but it is something that I would like to kind of explore as a means of being able to you know, kind of square the circle in some of the tensions that are happening in the stakeholder management space.
Okay, thanks. Do you guys want to say anything about self-employment? Or
I don't need, just briefly, just to kind of endorse the point that was made, 'cause I think it's really important, and the responses on the panel so far. And I mean, Job Centre Plus still it still acts as a public employment service and delivers kind of particularly kind of recruitment support. And although I guess a little like work programme providers, there is a focus on national employers, and we have a kind of national account management system for larger employers. At local level, it's done very much with SMEs. But I completely endorse the point about communications. We've had several goes at this because it does seem that because it's so localised, very often employers don't know that job centres are there, and there's often a perception in what they think might be on offer and what we can practically do. Now, universal credit in different ways may make it easier to recruit people. I think it's one of those things where until we actually get there, we won't know. But it should make that kind of progression from what was being on benefit to being employment a bit easier around, we hope. And certainly talking to employers is a big part of the UC design process.
Thank you. Rob?
Well, I'm not sure I have a great deal of value added to offer on this. I think the other three are probably much more interesting on this topic. Yeah, SMEs and poverty. Presumably it's helpful if you can get people to employ unemployed people. If you want me to return to my the point I chose to highlight in my opening remarks, I suppose, you know, if you're interested in specific goals in relation to household incomes, then there's no guarantee that unemployed people come from low-income households. So, you know, again, there is a targeting issue if the focus is specifically on distributional objective. Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you off the hook. Any more points? I'll go to here, please.
My name is Suraj. I'm an independent non-consultant. Can I ask a question about the work programme, the age distribution? Clearly, there's an economic and political imperative of focusing on people who are 16 to 24 with low skills. To what extent is the work programme also focusing on older people, say over 50s, over 60s, who want employment but are not in employment, given that in the long term, with an aging society, you do want older people to be employed as well as younger people? Where is the focus at the moment?
Yeah, I think one for Vinny, maybe Tim.
It seems to be, doesn't it? Absolutely agree, to be honest. I mean, I think there is a focus on young people quite rightly because they've got longer in the labour market. But even someone at 50 has probably got 15, 16, 17 years left in the labour market. And I think what I wouldn't want to see is, and whether this is too political to say it, but what happened with incapacity benefit way back when people were just not having the support and were actually almost parked on incapacity benefit, kind of left there, and we're trying to kind of, through Labour and through the Conservatives, actually, you know, trying to reactivate that group. But what I wouldn't want to see is that sort of thing happening. And one of the concerns which was raised this morning was that a lot of the skills funding is actually being targeted at younger people, which again I think is a good thing, but it shouldn't be to the detriment of those over 25 or the much older workers. I mean, I think what I'd say from our provision is that it's kind of age blind, in that people who come through our door will understand what their barriers to work are, and regardless of whether they're 18 or 60, it's still the same process about trying to help them and particularly some of the regions we operate in, I mean, some of the industrial regions, a lot of them are older workers that have been impacted by the kind of the creative destruction of the economic base previously. You know, your manufacturing industries, your dock industries, those sorts of industries. And actually, they're finding themselves, you know, since the 80s, and some of the newer people coming through as a result of the creative destruction from this current recession. People are actually, you know, they are older workers that are looking to reskill, to upskill, to have the transferable skills to move into something else, because the jobs that they were initially trained for don't exist, or don't exist in the numbers that they did. So for us, it is firstly about building the self-efficacy, that self-confidence, that appetite for learning, without which it's quite difficult to help people reskill. But to us, that is one of the focus of the provision, is to as I say, age blind, is just, you know, to get the basic skills correct, because they are the fundamental basis of job entry, of job sustain, job progression. For a lot of people, a lot of the older people in particular, it's IT skills, basic IT skills that are lacking. And we heard this morning from Dave Simmons, and I agree entirely with what he said in terms of, you know, all the information about jobs are out there on the internet. So there's this kind of transparency issue. That's fine if you can access the internet. But a lot of our clients, I know work that DWP have done, don't have, it's that digital divide. I think even that sort of thing about instilling those basic skills, again, whether you're 18 or 60, it will have a positive labour market attachment effect.
You say you're age blind, but our employers necessarily age blind.
Well, I think Policy Exchange have done some interesting research on that. I think that's coming out soon, so I don't want to give away the answers. But
I mean, just on that, I mean, we do work with employers to break down some of the negative perceptions that they have. I mean, we are working with a very difficult kind of client group as a whole, which doesn't have a particularly great reputation in the media. You know, I mean, all the things that we hear in the media about benefit cheats, I mean, it doesn't do any favours to anybody on the work programme. So we work with employers to say, you know, and getting employers in front of our clients and our clients in front of employers, almost a kind of bit of a social networking of, look, these are the people, these are the skills they can bring, and that's how you break down the barriers. And that's something we do in the UK, it's something we're doing in France as well. And actually trying to break down any barriers or any negative perceptions they have about the group as a whole, about ages, sometimes even ethnicity. You know, actually in some areas, and trying to break those sorts of barriers down by working at, again, that nexus of supply and demand.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think this is very, the age dimension is a very interesting one here, and it reminds me a bit of the kind of economic literature, or the labour supply literature, which shows that people between 55 and 70 are particularly responsive to financial incentives in terms of their decision about whether to work, along with parents of school-aged children. They're the sort of demographic group who do seem to be particularly responsive on that margin. So it may well be the case that for basically the same reasons. So I should say the same thing. People at IFS have recommended on that basis that you might want to design the tax system accordingly to focus, to give those people the strongest incentives to work, because they're the people who are most responsive. And maybe for similar reasons, there would be arguments for focusing resources in terms of work programs on that group as well, because they do appear to be responsive.
Okay. Could I take 3 questions and then we'll pass them to the panel at the front, please?
Yeah, a question about progression.
Could you say who you are?
Sorry, name and project from Community Links. So a question about progression, and it would be really interesting to see that factored into the work programme as an outcome. But I'm a bit concerned about how that relates to in-work conditionality. And really think that the answer to that, and it'd be nice to hear your thoughts on what the definition of progression is, because currently we're looking at in-work conditionality as income times minimum wage, hours worked, etc. And it poses a really difficult question of A, for providers, when we're looking at full-time employment, what's going to be considered an outcome?
Yep.
And B, how do you get that balance right of somebody that from their perspective, they think progression is to move up in their career, therefore 16 hours work plus sort of X amount of hours doing some form of training to get some qualifications is progression in their minds. How do you balance that with an advisor saying, actually, we need to ensure that you progress 35 hours minimum wage? I think that definition of progression is fundamental and a shared agreement amongst both different government departments but also delivery bodies.
Okay, thank you. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I'm Giselle Corey from the Resolution Foundation. I think when you started off with the question, you said any answers or any questions, so I kind of a bit of both. And in terms of the answer, not quite an answer, but a little bit of work we've just done is to commission Alan Manning of the LSE to look at minimum wage for us. And Robert, you mentioned that it's not a very well targeted anti-poverty tool. I think there are ways it can be better targeted. I think the paper suggests broadly three, which is to perhaps have a regionally variable minimum wage, especially if a bit higher, to get something going in terms of voluntary agreements for living wage, or choose something age dependent. Now I'm not saying I endorse any of those, it's just a paper we've put out rather than a suggestion from us, but there are ways perhaps the minimum wage could be tweaked to have more people. And secondly, a question. So minimum wage not that great in terms of a kind of efficient poverty for people in work. Also, we know that from what you said, Tim, that the ERA pilot has shown us that there's no cost-effective and consistent results for how to do in work support. So, do we have any suggestions about what does work?
Yeah. Okay. And one at the back. Yes, Vivian.
Megan at Trust for London. We've got an enormous number of low-paid jobs here in the capital, and I was just wondering, in terms of your thoughts, how we make low-paid jobs into good jobs. Can we do that without addressing the issue of low pay? Is that the solution, or are there other ways that we can do that?
Okay, that will do for now. Do you want me to remind you of the questions? Or
No, it's fine. Shall I do the first
please
question
do.
and then
Yeah.
the second half of the second question?
Yep,
if that makes
that'll
sense. I mean, I completely agree. I thought, we've got to get this right. It's still at the design stage, as you probably all know. Doubtless, and I don't know what the time scales are, but I suspect it'll be a kind of conversation over the next year, and I'm sure it will be an iterative conversation about what's the right way to adjust the work programme payment model. The one thing I would say, I think all those factors are really important. One of the things we really got out of ERA actually was a lot of qualitative stuff about how people perceive themselves when they're in work. And we're doing an awful lot of work at the moment, which I think will start to come through, about how people who are currently on tax credits, who currently have very little, if nothing, to do with DWP, might feel about coming back into being part of a benefit system under universal credit, let alone being part of some kind of formal conditionality regime. So on the kind of design of the conditionality, I'm sure we will take it slowly and steadily. As you might imagine, there isn't an awful lot of public money floating around to design grand new systems really quickly anyway, so I'm sure it'll be slow. The one thing about the payment models is, as work programme providers will know, it's always constrained by what we can measure. And the great exciting thing about universal credit for me as an analyst is just the amount of real-time kind of earnings data that we all get about individuals that will allow us to do much more sophisticated evaluation, I hope, but also build it into payment models. So the scope is there to do some more creative things, and I think be less constrained than we have been in the past. And I've now forgotten the ERA question. I'm so sorry.
It was what if? Well, my understanding was that it's the message from ERA is not that nothing works.
Oh well, it was
just
more
that
that
some bits work for some groups.
Yeah, some of it worked for some groups, and we didn't find the right. We didn't find a magic answer, I think. But it doesn't mean that we couldn't do. One of the things that we haven't really talked about, but I know providers think about it all the time, we're trying to think about it, is about if you could get to a more effective segmentation of the customer base, so that you are focusing on those people who are most at risk of falling out of employment. That would really help target and really solve the cost effectiveness problem. Our problem is that we haven't yet found an effective targeting system, and we're testing 1 or 2 things out at the moment. We're testing some of the Australian models of segmentation and customer classification, but nothing yet. Okay.
So, well, the questions were paraphrasing, what's a good definition of progression, and how do you create progression? And I think Mubin's question was, can you have a good job that isn't well paid? Is that a fair summary?
We need lots of low-paid jobs, low skilled jobs in the future. Key issues around pay and whether or not you know, in terms of the commission that you've set up, how do you make those jobs better?
Yeah. So any other, Moira?
Just a thought on the definition and sort of measure of progression, and there's I think there's a tension here. We produced a report called the Review of Employment and Skills, and towards the end of the report it suggests a basket of measures for progression and different elements.
I think you're feeding back a little.
I'm not sure what I can do about that. Just, can I turn myself down a bit? Maybe I'll just, can people hear me?
Yeah.
That's good, like without the mic. So we produced a diagram, a kind of fan diagram, which showed what we thought were different elements of progression or different aspects of progression in work, and different ways you might measure that. Now clearly we think there's more to progression than increased pay. So it's job autonomy, satisfaction. There are a whole number of elements that can count as progression in work for individuals. The tension is, of course, that constraints on the public person, if we're not to end up paying more through universal credit than we did with the benefits system, then we need to have a cut-off point, and we need to have a level at which the government stops topping up, but to make sure that people are better off in work, though. So there's a tension, there's a driver here to make progression very much about pay and increasing hours and increasing your pay. And the other side of the coin is we're telling employers that creating good jobs and quality work doesn't need to always mean giving pay rises. You know, there are other ways you can create good work for people and make it a satisfying place to be, and something which individuals would see as progression for them in their jobs, whether it is more autonomy.